I have no idea how this is going to go. I haven't really practiced going through the whole thing too much, but general overview is question. If you need me to stop and answer something, by all means, stop me. This isn't just me going on a 25-minute rant. I can do that if you want, but this is supposed to be a little more informative and educational. And we're going to start off with is what defense is, how to do it, techniques, move towards Mawashi slash Beta Ari, and then do some exercise and some closing thoughts. All right, then. I will start in about 10 seconds if we're ready.
Harrison, do you want to do a brief intro about who Corak is, why we should care,
Oh,
before we
geez.
continue?
I could try and muster up the voice for that. So, Korak, one of the people that I definitely consider myself mentored in the image of probably the strongest player in a good 70-mile radius from us. I would say very accomplished, Ho-Oh, very long time player, very strong. Korak, you're not demoting out of A1 this season, right?
God, I hope not.
Okay, so has been in A1 since its inception in Armel, something that only Kim and Max Light Pink Yoshi have been able to do, not counting hiatuses or coming in late. They're at what, 7 seasons now? 6 seasons?
Let's see. This
Or
is
no, you're
what,
probably at
season
nine?
10, I think. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
9 or 10.
we've done 9 because first
Yeah,
season was the inaugural beta. But just my resume, my Mahjong resume, I've been through the game since 2014, mostly on Tenho, but I played all sorts of platforms. I'm also known in Mahjong Soul as having gotten the first Saint title because I said, why does Sama not even have anyone
yeah,
who's
the
done this? I
Saints
can do
on the.
that.
Just gonna bring that up as a
And
fun fact.
I've been in the IRMC. I had a record 5 straight qualification for the US team, something that hasn't been matched. I've been in A1 the entire time. And just kind of a side project the last couple of weeks. I went ahead and grabbed up to Mahjong Master in 50 games in Final Fantasy. So I've been through the game for a long time, seen a different bunch of different ways, different play styles, etc. So I'm definitely considered one of the veterans. But let's jump in. So this presentation is defense and what mostly safe means. I am Corak from Baltimore Mahjong, and I'm presenting here to the DC Ricci Club. And of course, the very first thing I do is double click, always a good sign. So, basic answer, basic question, what are we doing? What is defense? Well, you have actually safe tiles, as your Gimbutsu. These are the tiles that have been discarded by the person that you're trying to defend against. Well, after that, what do we do? Because even the newest player can just see, hey, I see a 6-0 out there. I should throw a 6-0. And that's perfectly fine. So, what is defense? It is the process of trying to minimize both likelihood and expense when you do inevitably deal in. And how do you do it properly? You reverse engineer basic techniques of how to build hands. Note, presents an obvious problem. If you follow people that aren't playing proper efficiency, a lot of the techniques won't be nearly as effective because they're not following the same structure. They may take that one weight left chonky that should be safe because they're not that worried about it. It'll come out. And the answer is it sometimes will. But generally, what ends up happening is people are building for value, and particularly in closed hands with Ricci, one of the most underrated aspects is the Menzen Sumo Yaku. Because you get extra value for drawing the tile yourself, people will inevitably try to build for it, which means you'll often see better weights, better tiles in the wall, and you just want to incentivize getting everything you can out of a hand. So defense is the exact opposite, saying, knowing they're doing that, I need to prevent some of the most common ways for them to build value. If they do sumo, there isn't anything I can do about it, but I can prevent myself from dealing in and following consistent patterns that other people will try to take advantage of. So, the first thing that you should do when you look at a situation is okay, someone called Ricci. What's their pawn say? Is it your normal Pinfu or Tanya hand? This will tend to be a pretty standard structure where you start with honors, usually terminals, and slowly work your way inwards. And then later on, you may see a 4 or a 6 or even a red 5 in there somewhere, and just slowly work towards the middle as the hand develops. Second, if they're open, what are they calling with? What is their Yaku? This is an underestimated aspect that a lot of people just flat out forget about. And especially when you are calling things with terminals, the question is, what's your Yaku? And it can be something a little unconventional, like a Sanshoku or an Itsu, a full straight or a mixed triple sequence, or it can just be your standard, I'm waiting for value honor. I don't particularly care what you're doing. Similarly, the other option is what happens if they're just throwing middle tiles at the start. Again, for beginners, they may do this because they see a floating 5 as not that much different from a floating 1, floating being isolated in this context. But of course, people that have been at the game and been at a reasonably high level for a while will realize that 5, of course, will connect to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the 1 will connect to 1, 2, and 3. So they'll generally tend towards the middle. If people are discarding mid tiles early, that should immediately set off flags. Are they going for a Honitsu or half flush? Are they going for a Chanta, says Junshahen? Is it a Chitoitsu? Is it a Kokushi Muso? These types of things will become clearer and clearer as you go on through the hand, but it should get your attention immediately if people are dumping a 4, a 5, or a 6, or even a 3 or a 7 is their first discard. Why did that come out? And that's one of the really important questions as you're going through the game is why did that tile come out? And it'll become more important as you go through the game and get closer to Tempai. Similarly, if there's an early Dora cut, Dora, of course, are the bonus tiles that everyone's always looking for. So if it comes out early, then the number of hands that someone could actually be going for are incredibly limited. The only real exception to this is if you're in a very late game, like South 3 or South 4, and the person just wants to get rid of the tile immediately so that it's not called. Similarly, if it's not that late, about the only times you'll ever see it is A, the hand is so good they feel they don't need the door, especially it's like a north tile or a green dragon or something like that, that they already have a planned Richi Pin Futanyo hand. They don't really need it. The other one is they're just trying to get rid of it now, and they can't really integrate it into the hand because they're going for a more unconventional hand. It won't fit in no matter what they do. If you see a red 5-mon, for example, and it's a Chanta hand, well, they'd rather get rid of it now rather than stall on it and have it get more dangerous later. So those are the types of things you're looking for very early in a hand, and 80-90% of hands will still be of this normal pin Futanyo. And that's why it's so important to pay attention for when things come out that don't immediately trigger that, hey, wait, why is this going on? And how do I need to adjust to it? So now we talk about techniques for different ways of managing hands. There's the most common one that everyone knows, which is Suji. Now, this is actually a bit understood. There are multiple types of Suji. The one that most people refer to as kind of the regular, which basically says you can't have an open-ended shape that will deal in with another tile. What this means is that if a 4 is discarded, the 1 and 7 cannot also deal in if it is a good weight, i.e., a 2 3 or a 5 6, due to the rules of Furiten. But you'll also notice that particularly the 3 and the 7 will end up dealing into quite a few shapes simply because penchants or 1 2 or slash 8 9 shapes will much more often be there, particularly early when people haven't had a chance to get rid of them. So be very careful on those Sujis on 3 7s, but just generally, it's kind of an if I don't have a better option, throw a Suji out. They're reasonably safe because, as I mentioned earlier, the goal in most games is to sumo the tile. And if you have a bad weight, it's generally harder to sumo. So there's a second type of Suji, which is Matagi Suji. So you may have heard that it's dangerous throwing tiles near the Richi. That's because of Matagi Suji. So the idea is if you have like a 5-5-6 or a 3-3-4 shape, that the tiles around that structure will be very dangerous. And the reason for this is you kind of want those bloated shapes as long as possible, just because a 3-3-4 would not only accept the 2-5, it will also accept the 3, or you could even use the 3-3 as a pair cutting 4 if something continues elsewhere. So generally, tiles closer towards the end of the discards before a Ricci or before when you think someone is temp by will become slightly more dangerous. Now there's Urasugi, which is a different concept. You may have heard of this in Akagi, but it's much more of an old style thing where basically what you're doing is you're taking a Kanchan weight, such as a 5-7, discarding the 7 because you drew a 4, and this makes the 3-6 more dangerous in theory. Now, the problem is this is pretty well understood and statistically proven that it doesn't actually exist. In terms of actual play data, which has been through millions of Ho-Oh logs, which is the highest level in Tenho, that it's no different than any other Suji. So you may have heard of it as a technique, but it actually doesn't matter. Now, the idea of Mitagi Suji is similar, but it's the same type of structure. Now, one of those things, going back to Mitagi Suji, is interestingly, you'll find that people will try occasionally to slim down, especially in their early to mid second row, from those bloated shapes simply because they want to keep a safe tile. So you can also keep an eye on what those tiles are between discards 7 to 9 or so, and try and figure out maybe that was one of the shapes in their hand. So, similarly, Sotogawa. This is a much underutilized defensive technique. What it basically says is early discards, if you're following a regular hand, then those early discards are less likely to be usable tiles. If someone's throwing an early 3 or an early 2, chances are the 1 is pretty safe. Because the only way it's not is if they have enough blocks already. And if you've looked at most hands, you don't usually have 6 good blocks, 5 good blocks, etc., to where you could really afford to give up the extra acceptance here. And so Sotagawa is the basic idea that people will generally build getting rid of the most useless tiles first and build for efficiency. Now, going back to something else I said earlier, remember, if people are building inefficiently, this technique is far less useful because they may say, hey, I have 7 blocks here. So I don't really need this extra this extra tile that's connected to something else. But it ends up being less reliable overall. Techniques, honors, we don't know what to do. Well, considering most people are waiting for Ricci Pinfu or Ricci Pinfu Tanyao, or something along those lines, just throwing out the honors is often not a terrible idea. Of course, if you have 2 of them and someone deals a third, it's going to be an expensive deal in, but it's generally not particularly dangerous, especially if one is already out. Now, this is something that applies more on the higher end. On the lower end, you have people who are willing to keep those single floating honor for a lot longer, so that when it does pair up, you may end up sacrificing immediate efficiency for their potential value later. This is a bad estimated value calculation, but you'll see a lot of it on the lower end. So be a little more careful, especially if you're playing with new or relatively new players. Next thing, door and expected greed. So similarly, people are trying to build efficiency. What else are they trying to do? They're trying to build value. People are much more likely to take irregular and unexpected weights around the Dora or using the Dora. Now, there, of course, have been plenty of jokes out there about Dora theory. Pros don't sit on Dora. Well, I don't think any of us are pros, and everyone sits on Dora a lot. But it's not usually the most dangerous tile of all the available Suji. The most dangerous tile is usually the Dora indicator because there's one less of it. People, of course, see the Dora, say, I've got to use it, connect to something nearby, and it may or may not be a great shape. But with one less of those tiles available, the Dora indicator is often a very dangerous option. You have a 6 and an 8. Door indicator is the 7. Of course, you're going to use that door. You're not going to cut this block, even though you may have better options elsewhere, because you want the Dora here. Ada Yonken. So this is something that hasn't really been around in the community that long, but it's incredibly effective. So what it is basically you take a shape like a 3, 5, 6, 8. And you see a 3 and an 8 discarded, and you say, what's the Suji in between them? Well, it's a 4 and a 7, one higher than the lowest one and one lower than the highest one when you're 5 apart. And it's because of this specific shape. Now, of course, if you have a 3, 5, 6, 8, and you have enough blocks, you'll use it as a 3-5 and a 6-8. But generally, you're trying to build shapes to accept as many tiles as possible. So you'll specifically try and turn it into that Rionman shape. And this will make the 4-7 significantly more dangerous. This is something to keep your eye out on as something that people do even subconsciously, and it pops up a lot more than you may expect. Next one is Kabe or one chance. So if someone cons 2-pin, that means 1-pin's reasonably safe because the only thing it can deal into is a Tonki or a Shampon. Now, the interesting thing with this is that's not really true for the person who makes the con. And this is just because if you are building a set based hand and you have all these twos left over and you draw a fourth one, then there's a very good chance you had a 1-1-2-2-2 shape and were either waiting there for some sort of Upeco upgrades or some sort of cut the 1-1 and just go Tanyao. So it's not necessarily applicable to that specific person, but in general, if you see a wall of threes, the 2 and the 1 are reasonably safe. If you see a wall of eights, the 9 is safe. You see a wall of fives, then you combine this with other things like Suji, and you see all the fives. That means the 3 and the 7 can be treated as Suji. Now, remember I said earlier, the 3 and the 7 are weaker Suji in general, but they are Suji. And the reason for this is you can't have a 4-5. You can't have a 5-6 because you see all of them. So the goal here is to try and use as many of these different techniques in combination in order to determine what is safe or relatively safe. And again, this is generally assuming people are following normal efficiency techniques. As I said earlier, if the hand structure looks really weird, you see a bunch of early mid tiles, or just Honitsu, where they don't particularly care about the shape of the hand, they just want speed and value, then a lot of this stuff will be less useful. Okay, so we talked about those open hands for a while, and the difference is you can't necessarily tell when someone's open, when someone's tempai if they're open. Of course, you can't tell if they're tempai either if they're just dominant. We'll get into that in a little bit. But when someone is open and they've made a bunch of calls, you should really start determining, okay, what is coming out and why? When is the safe talk? Is that something that usually should be a dead giveaway? And if you see a third call or even a second call and then just a random pay or Shaw, a north or west tile comes out, you go, wait a second. So that means usually it's a pretty dead sign that someone's tempai. So in Honitsu hands, it's much harder because you don't know the immediate structure of what the hand was. But the instant you start seeing overflow, that means the chances of them being tempai goes up significantly. It is possible to get a hand with no extra overflow coming out, but it's exceedingly rare. Now, we talked about this from kind of the beginner side, that things like Suji will often be less reliable for new players. On the other hand, you have the opposite side. People on the other side will be trying to intentionally set up traps to have people deal into Suji. So, especially with some of these irregular hands, these penchon, if you have a chitoitsu, that type of thing, people will be trying to reverse engineer your reverse engineered techniques. So you may end up with a random take a shampoo over the standard Ryanman. You could end up with, of course, if your hand's already a Tonki, you have your 4 completed shapes, you just need to pick what your last tile is, you'll often just sit on it. Now, there's no guaranteed way of checking it out other than trying to follow the pond and see if all the information is making sense. And that's going to be the consistent theme throughout this presentation is try and use the information that the people are giving you in order to establish what they're doing. You won't know all of it, but as long as you can limit down the potential options, then you have a lot more ways of going forward. The next thing, Chitoitsu or Toy Toy. So we're seeing a whole bunch of mid tiles come out, and I'm not really understanding what's going on. Well, chances are it may just be a set based hand. And especially once they've called maybe a green dragon or a one mon pawn or an eight so pawn, they're like, okay, well, this is moving towards Toy Toy. Chitoitsu can be disguised But especially if you're dealing with people that really like going for it, they'll often try and make the pond look a little suspicious, but tend not to. They try to do it and end up doing it pretty poorly. Towards the end, especially, you'll see a lot more of those tiles come out. You can never guarantee that a hand is Shitoitsu, but it should be something you're generally thinking about. So one of the things you have to worry about in both of these situations is if you have identified that it could potentially be a Toitoi or a Chitoitsu, how do you defend against it? Because Suji means absolutely nothing. Well, it's kind of the opposite. If we're assuming that people are building for Ryanman in a Pinfu Tanyao type hand, they're going to be building for Shampon or Tonki for Chitoitsu or Toitoi. So it's basically the opposite idea. If we see a lot of the tiles of, say, 3 9 so are visible to us, it's probably pretty safe. If you deal in, it's going to only deal into that Tonki. Now, Chanta Junchan, they're out there. You generally don't have to worry too much about them because it's very hard to build value from them, and they're incredibly transparent. I would honestly just ignore it until you either see 3 call or a Dora or some sort of Dora pawn. And that goes back to the earlier thing that I talked about, which is what's the pawn telling you? Do you even need to be worried about it? Chanta and Junchan, especially open, just aren't worth anything. Junchan can be if it stacks with things like Sanchoku and Adora, so you can easily identify whether the door in there. And if it's not, it's only going to deal into 3,900, even worst case. Kokoji Muso, on the other hand, is a little different. This tends to be very obvious that someone's going for it. Now, if you're doing it correctly, you'll end up kind of bluffing towards a Honitsu with it, or half flush. But if you're not, and you see someone throwing all sorts of mid tiles in every suit, willing to shove almost anything, then you need to be immediately tracking whether any of those terminals slash honors have died. And generally, you can still push in it, but once you start seeing a bunch of overflow, I would say 2 tiles. There isn't a hard and fast rule on this. Then you might consider just folding out on it. And at the same time, what you would be keeping as a normal safe tile against a Pinfu Tanya hand is exactly the opposite on a Koguji. You do not want to have those straggling honors because that's exactly what they're looking for. Well, here's the other problem. You're not dealing with just one person. There are 3 people at the table. So, if we don't have anything safe, do we even care? If it's 1,000 point hand and dealer reaches, but I can throw a tile that's safe to the dealer, maybe the guy that's open for a Tanya has a Dora in there. 2,000, sure. I guess we'll take it. It's better than having the dealer sumo and everyone paying out 4,000. Similarly, well, that's the obvious question. Is anyone else pushing? Is it just me shoving? Is it just the dealers? Everyone else kind of dancing around? Are they pushing a little bit or are they just shoving? And if they're shoving, generally remember you're not defending against one person, you're defending against 2 people. And kind of an underrated issue, but not one you're going to come across in ladder as much. Is it someone that you've dealt with before and is known to Dama a lot? And I can't really give good advice on when someone is Dama, but it should be one of those things where should someone be closed tempai by that point? And what are we starting to see overflow from their hand? If they're still shoving 4s and 6s, if they're shoving a late 8 so and the 7 so's Dora, then chances are they're either tempai or they're Ishant, and you need to be very careful around it. Another thing to be paying attention to, win conditions, especially late in the game. South 4, if 4th place is shoving, it means nothing because they have to shove. If first is up by about 3 or 4,000 and they're just shoving anything into Ricci, they're probably tempai. Alternatively, if first is shoving up 20,000 into a non-dealer Ricci, they probably don't care if they deal in because they're going to win anyway. So be paying attention to what someone's doing. You'll occasionally see people passing on wins, but very unlikely, and that is specifically in South 4 conditions. Now there's also Sakigiri. We talk about defense and oh God, what are we doing? We're tempai. We should be thinking about things a little bit before that and getting rid of some of our more dangerous tiles, especially as we start getting to the point at which most hands will get to tempai and most players will start being able to reach you, which tends to be in that mid-second row. So I'd say I tend to keep a safe tile somewhere between turn 5 and 8 if I'm going to. But you should be thinking about, do I really want that extra bloated 4-4-5 in this hand? Do I really want this extra tile that would accept Dora in this hand, but I'm going to have to shove the Dora indicator to be able to hold it? Those types of decisions need to be made earlier, and you'd be able to establish, okay, why am I doing this? And that's the important thing, is making sure your decisions are consistent and logical, that you're facing your, however comfortable you are with your own risk threshold. Don't let anyone else tell you what is the safest or what is the most dangerous tile. It's what are you comfortable with, because you may have to shove it later. And if you're not willing to shove it, then you should probably get rid of it earlier. So, some common mistakes. Adjust with more information becomes available. The discards from other players and what they think is safe can actually give info. Now, you may see a random 3-mon come out. Whoa, that guy's shoving. And then you take a look at the pond and you see there are 2 4-mon out. You can probably infer that if it was not a hard shove, particularly if they've just been folding up until now, they may have another 4 and potentially 2 of them. Similarly, if they're throwing the 3 rather than one of those 4s, they may also be shoving, so you need to be paying attention to them going forward. Now, a term I've heard recently that I really like is emotional safe tiles. This is something where you know it's not doing you any good, but it makes you feel comfortable holding that safe tile. Stop doing that. If you have a safe tile, there should be a reason for it. And similarly, if you're in a situation where you don't have safety, that's when you get rid of it, particularly when everyone is open. Because the main reason for a safe tile is to avoid a catastrophic deal in, most notably during the Ipatsu turn. So remember, the goal of the game is to get points, not just to avoid dealing in. You're going to have risk and you're going to deal in occasionally. Just be aware of what you're doing and why you're doing it. Suji traps, especially from Sumigiri Richi. This is something I always watch. Is it a Sumigiri Richi? And Sumigiri Richi being drew the tile, called Richi, discarded the same tile, didn't put it into my hand. Okay, so there are usually 3 main reasons this happens, and all of which should get your attention. And most people say you don't have to track Sumigiri that often. I'm one of them. The Ricci declaration is one of those times you really need to be paying attention to it. So there are 3 basic things a Sumigiri Ricci means. Usually it means the weight is bad. So a lot of the standard Suji type techniques are much less reliable. Number 2, it could be a Suji itself just came up and it said, "Hey, I have a Suji now. I can discard this because I have a Suji trap." Do not trust Suji tiles to the Ricci, especially on a Sumogiri. I see this all the time in Gold Room, Joku. Kind of your mid-level players will think the most clever trick ever. And once you've seen it once, you'll never have to worry about it again because you just immediately think in your mind, okay, that actually reduces the amount of weights it can be on. And really, the third one is much less likely. And that's, I didn't like this hand, but I'm kind of running out of time. That this weight's bad, but if I don't declare reach, I'm gonna have to fold out, and I don't really want to. Well, I'm the only person that's probably temp by here. The last thing I'm going to say is keeping a bunch of safe tiles when you're trying to push, but everyone else is open. So again, those safe tiles have a purpose, and particularly if you're not worried about the catastrophic deal in, you don't have a Ricci on the board. You know the Dora is dead because it was a red dragon. You just see 3 of them in front of you. The red Dora, if you're playing with them, are accounted for. Maybe you have 1 or 2 in your hand. So the worst you're going to deal into is maybe a Tanyao Sanchugu Dora 1. So be aware of what you're doing and what efficiency you're sacrificing when you're holding on to things. Ah, yes. This is Harrison's favorite topic, I know. So, one of the things I actually had to learn defense, I got hard stuck in Tenho ladder at 6 dan, kind of 5 to 6 dan. And so I said, okay, I have to go back to the drawing board. So I actually took some time off and played Sama, and it actually did a surprisingly effective method of teaching how to defend against irregular shapes. Anyone can just follow Suji and go forward, but especially in Sanma, you're intentionally setting Suji traps, especially in a rule with sumo loss. So you don't care if someone deals in for 5,200 because your sumo would only be 5,200. You just want to win the hand. Similarly, there are a lot of Shampoo, there are a lot of honors. You have those extra 1/9 mana as well. So you're often going to be on these irregular shapes you need to be aware of. You need to be counting a lot more of what's available, what's out there. You can't just get away with folding. This is probably the most important thing. If there are only 3 people at the table and you're folding and you're not dealer, that means one of the 2 players at the rest of the table is the dealer and has a very good chance of a repeat. And especially if it's dealer reachy, that means that things won't turn over. Eventually, someone has to win hand, and you're relying on only one person to try and bail you out and move the hand along, as opposed to 2. This is something that's very important in 3-player mahjong. So rotating the dealer turn is much harder, and this is how you get people on really big runs. You can't hard fold, and of course you have the most basic problem, which is there are just a lot less types of tiles. You have 27 potential tiles instead of the 34 you'd have in Yonma game. So you need to be aware of all of the following: that shapes are worse, you have to push, it's harder to shut things down, and of course, dealing in is so much more expensive because that sumo loss. But at the same time, you get worn down over time. So it incentivizes you to just be willing to push a lot more. And of course, these are kind of your Tenho Majso rules. There are other rules where sumo's actually split, like on Ronron. If you are a non-dealer and you sumo Hanemon, each of them pays 6,000. There is no sumo loss. And in those situations, you just have to shove a lot harder. And folding is actually a bit to your detriment, even almost over dealing the tile itself. So remember your rules, remember what your goals are, and just remember that there are less tiles out there, so it's harder to move the game along, and folding is just inherently weaker in the way that the game is played. So this kind of leaves us towards the main topic here. How do we fight without just hard pushing or Zensu? Every tile has its own relative danger. Something to remember is, okay, we see these tiles, this pond. We saw the early 3-mon in here. That means the 1-2 are reasonably safe. Is the 6? Well, maybe, but I don't know enough about that unless I see the rest of the table. Of course, we see the tiles near the reach here, or near the door, are always really, really bad until we get more information from the rest of the table. How far are we? What's our hand? What's our hand quality? What's our hand speed? What's our hand value? Are we willing to take these risks? Similarly, how to fight without Zentu. This is the big one. What are the lateral movements, which is the ability to move the hand forward, or not even forward, but sideways, that don't involve just hard pushing anything? And usually what that involves is just cutting the pair off and then saying, all these tiles in my hand that I wasn't quite sure of, one of them may become my pair. And in fact, that tile may end up being the one I was scared of pushing. It may be the Dora. It may be something I wasn't quite sure about before and was kind of iffy on. And then there are other things, such as combining the different techniques. Sotogawa mid-hand. This is something you do all the time. Is someone threw a 3 early, and then I see a wall of 7s. Well, if I see a Kabe of 7s, or even a 1 chance of 7s, and the 3 was early, that means the 1 is probably safe. I know the 7 is safe. That means the 4 is Suji. This is something a lot of people don't really think about at the time. But if you're using the information the table is providing you going forward, it should start making more sense. Similarly, if you see a 3 and then a wall of 8s, it's like, okay, well, the 3's safe. The 3's the discard. 2 is 2 Sotogawa. So we see an 8 and a 2. The 5's reasonably safe. Now, of course, they could be waiting on the red Dora. They could just have an irregular shape in general. But those types of things what you're looking for on how to push things forward. And remember, the farther away you are, the more willing you should be to just push the safer tiles first. Because if you don't have a high win rate, why are you exposing yourself to danger? And it should just be something that comes naturally. It's like, we're 3 away. I mean, I'll shove a once cut honor for now. But at the same time, I don't want to shove this 8-mon in my hand when it's just a life Suji. It might not be that bad. At the same time, I could deal a Richi Pinfu Tanyao. And we just kind of determine those basic ideas that what's the most likely to deal in and what's the most expensive to deal in. And especially those tiny out tiles, especially if they're isolated. We don't see many of those Mon tiles from other players, then maybe you don't want to shove one against the Ricci just yet. On the other hand, we get to Tempai, sure, we can just slam it. Mawashi, so this is the kind of sort of pushing. An old joke about this is Mawashi is what I say when I deal in, like what I was trying to do when I dealt in. So what you're doing is you're balancing that danger win rate. Win rate is more important than value when you're behind speed wise. Obviously, you may be willing to take more risk if you have more value, but if you have a weight option, you generally want to win the hand because that does two things. Not only do you get your value, you shut down the opponent, and more importantly, shut down their potential of sumo, where you'd have to pay it out anyway. So relatively safe again comes down to what you consider reasonably safe based on your own value of your hand, your quality of weight, and what danger you're seeing out there. If you see all the door out there, you can probably shove pretty aggressively with a lot of stuff. But at the same time, if you're three away for a 1,000 point hand, it's usually not worth it because they could always flip over a three on you. Even if we do get to Tempai, are we willing to shove it? This is kind of a different question of not counting Mawashi, but will we? If we have a leftover door that we're just never getting rid of, is it worth trying to push the rest of the hand, given we're never shoving the last tile under any circumstances? And the answer to that is usually no. Of course, if the door pairs up, you can consider it, but you also have to consider that someone probably is using that door in the first place, and it may not even be that good on the wall. So, general question: how much are we willing to push? This is a personal comfort level. Bots and AI tools can give you a reference of what they think it is, which is more aggressive than a human would. But in general, it comes down to you. How much safety do you have? How much information do you have? How much value is your hand worth? Will you have a good weight? Is this a challenge I want to take? And is it a challenge I'm willing to lose if I take it? So let's move on to some exercises. This seems like a pretty obvious situation. So we don't have a Yaku. We see a Dorapon across the way from first place. But this hand stinks. We have this leftover white dragon. We can't ever throw it. So why are we pausing here? Well, because Tempai payments are worth a lot. So the question is, dealer's hand is a mess. The hand on the right looks like it doesn't have a Yaku. If it is, it's some sort of weird Sanshoku. But we see all the 8-mon out, so even that's out. So they may end up on the same Shampon waiting for a particular honor. But regardless, we have no reason to ever shove the Haku, the white dragon. But on the other hand, we can figure there's a good chance they're stalemated, so we can actually just chi this and cut the 5. This allows us the 688 shape on the end, and we never have to cut this white dragon. If the player across has their Yaku already, it can't be a Sanshoku because we see 3 blocks already. They'd have to have a few more tiles in their hand available for that. So it's got to be a Yakuai. If they have all 3 of them and it's a Tonki, can we really defend well against it anyway? Nah. So with that, I will start opening the discussion, and let's take a look at the next one. So here, this is one where you see here, it deals in. But the reason here, is it worthwhile shoving the 2? And it's a Suji 5. And they say, so why is Suji to Ricci dangerous? And it's usually because of these 1-3-5 type shapes, Ryankan. So here the 2 does deal in, but the value is worth it here. We see 4,300 in the middle, and it deals in, and so be it. I'm not even mad about this. I can throw the 5 and it'd be safe, but is the 3 really going to help me? Or do I really, really want to win this hand? With 4,300 out there, even with just a Tanyo Dora 1, it's worth shoving if I deal in, I deal in. So here's one for the table. So we're kind of in the similar situation. We have that West Dora that we want to get rid of. The hand on the left is really weird. It started normal, and then we just see middle tiles in everything all of a sudden. So, especially with that 2 pin, why did that come out? We saw the 5, and the 5 pin, and then we see a 5 mana 4 and a 2 pin. What does that 2 pin still doing in that hand? It doesn't look particularly safe. It doesn't look particularly useful. We see 3 of the 1 pin out. So, especially the Sumagari Richi on the 3. What does the crowd think on this one?
I would think for this hand, it's most likely dealers playing a Chitoy with the odd kind of inside and especially that late 2 pin Tadashi, almost like a Suji trap weight that didn't quite get there. Um, and with that, I would think a good tile to discard to try to Mawashi here because Westwind cannot be dropped under any circumstance would be the 9 pin, as it's Genbutsu to dealer Richi, which we're assuming at a Chitoy, possibly waiting on Dora, is valuable. And if you need to most likely Tonki on the West, then cutting 9 pin is safe this turn. And then with the Nakasuji 6 pin, while it might be weird versus the Chitoy, it still, I would think, has a relatively smaller chance of dealing in, especially to the other two players as well.
Yeah, so this one I actually think there are two valid discards. You either cut the 9 pin and go forward for the exact same reason Harrison says, or you could cut the 6-5 in Manzu. The 5, of course, being safe, but that Sumigari Richi makes the 6 a little more suspicious. Why is that out there? At the same time, the Sumigari Richi, what did I say those Sumigari Richi rules were? It's either I'm out of time, which honestly it doesn't. He's turned 12. He doesn't care. I don't think that's it. It's a Suji came out late, so maybe the 6 pin looks really bad, or something else in the table changed. And I didn't see anything that's changed on the table. We see Sumo Gary's across the way. So I'm actually reading the 6 pin as probably the most dangerous tile on the wall right now. So if we want to push this, similarly though, we can't really throw the Dora because it may deal it on the right for all we know. It's live here. It may deal it across. So we're stuck with his Dora no matter what. We can throw the 7, but same kind of idea. That 4 came out, so I'm a little worried about the 7. But in the end, I agree. 9 pin. And it was, in fact, the 6 pin. I see the Suji, that's where the West were, and everyone was Tempai. That's the other part of this, is I also could have tried and just thrown the 3 and would have dealt in on the right for 1,000, which wouldn't have been a bad result here. But I'm worried across the way that it could be a Honitsu. Just looking at that pawn, that late 2 mon makes it unlikely, but I don't know enough about that hand to give any information either way. So the 9 pin is safe, but at the same time, we could have just gone with a 5 mon. The problem is that 6 mon looks really suspicious in that it was passed. So I'm thinking at this point it could be some sort of delayed wait where, oh, it just passed. Oops, I should have reached it earlier. So I'm going to slam it now. But to me, the 6 pin looks like the most dangerous tile out there. And as you see from here, we're probably going to end up folding anyway. We don't really want to throw the 7, so though I think we will, but we cannot continue with this West. At the same time, we have the 7 pin, we have the 5 mon, we have the 4 if we absolutely have to. We need to be careful on all of these because there's not only one person Tempai. We assume there are two. I'm a little surprised that C here on the right is also Tempai. But at the same time, you look at this hand, you realize, hey, we're the slowest one on the table. Even though the hand looks actually pretty decent here for Ricci Pinfu. But we're never throwing that West under these circumstances. And we're kind of lucky it's on the left because they could very easily be Champone weight for either of the other two. At the same time, as I said, you can always go with the 5, but I think the 9's a little bit stronger. All right, same thing. This is not a Sumagari Rishi, but we have seen a 4-6 mon cut. So that's a shape block, suggesting there's decent chances it's a good weight. No one get to jump in? All right.
I was gonna say I think south probably isn't terrible here. While it is a good way with two Dora out, um, I would probably much rather assume that it's a ground bend, and if south deals in, then it's Ricci, non, and then possibly one Dora, I would think on average.
And I'd agree with that. If we wanted to push this hand, then South South makes perfect sense here. I think it's very likely to be a weight. At the same time, there's a more basic question. What part of this hand is worth pushing? This hand is irredeemable garbage. So instead, I just cut the 4 pin and fold out. I would normally like to Mawashi a type of hand like this, but the hand is so far back, we see a dealer with a Dora call who's not really pushing hard, but is kind of pushing. I have reasonably safe tiles. As far as I'm concerned, to the rest of the hand, maybe I'll have to cut the south later, but I think just giving up this hand is fine. It's just going to be Ricci Pinfu in the best case. So although this is a discussion on Mawashi and relatively safe, at some point, remember, just give up sometimes. If the hand isn't worth it, don't expose yourself. All right, here's another one. Now you can
Sorry,
see
quick
here.
question, Corak, about the previous hand.
Sure.
Would you feel okay cutting a 6 mon, or are you too scared of the person on the right?
I'd be a little concerned about it. If that were Tempai, I'd probably shove the 6. But this hand just isn't worth it at this point. We did see the late 4 Tadashi. There's a decent chance that came from something around the 4, or maybe even a 4-6-8. So I don't think the 6 is necessarily the worst tie on the right because you see so many of the 4s, but it could just be a Sanshoku. We see that 6-7-8 call with Adora. So that's one where I
Yeah,
don't think it deals in a whole lot, but it could potentially be expensive. And this goes to what I was talking about, which is don't overexpose yourself. This hand is trash.
got it.
All right, what about this one? So we have this was another Sumagaricha. This is actually from the same person as earlier in the game, but the other one that did Sumagarichi. But so you can see here, I've actually pushed a few tiles already. I threw the 3 pin because it was one chance. We see 3 of the 4s here. Let's see. Yeah, 3 of the 4s, one on the right, 2 across. We pushed the 2 mon because I figured the hand was good enough to shove the 2. That one's debatable, but I think the 2 was a reasonable shove here. The 5 pin, of course, we see 3 of the 4s. If I push one chance once, I'll push it again. But this one's a little bit trickier. This 8. So we're starting to see upper Mon is just empty. It's gone. At the same time, we have another problem, which is that 6 Mon just came out. So that makes me think D is probably pushing, either pushing or just completely out of safe tiles, because that pawn just doesn't give any information. So what do we do here?
As a
I think like
question, I assume that we're not worried about how many points for our condition, correct? It's not like we need to get
We're a little
60,000
worried about
points.
that, but this is a league game, so
Yeah.
we'll assume we're playing for
mm,
plus minus. We'd love to
Okay.
be able to shove if we can.
Okay.
I think like um there's about like 6 Gs left on the table. So if Kami are like good shape tempai, there might be like about 15% dealing rate of for this 8 month. So I think like for EV we will still push that, but like the condition, um it looks like the dealer is folding. So if we don't deal in, it's pretty likely that we'll ensure this first place. So I think mm, it's okay to fold here, but like because it's like Tsumugi Ricci, I would still cut 8 month because it's hard to imagine that Kami is waiting on 5 8 month and did Ricci.
Yes, that was my initial thought as well. And I think this is one where you could actually go with both options. So the especially with that 9, if that 9 weren't here, I don't think you can ever cut the 8. But having cut the 9, it seems unlikely that this is a 6-7 shape because of the Sumigari Ricci. Again, what are those rules? That either something changed in the hand, which you didn't, a Suji trap got set up, which it didn't. It's like not even possible with those discards, or it's a bad shape and kind of ran out of time. So if we were just like flat scores, weren't playing for any sort of UMA, I think we just automatically shove this. But considering dealers out and that's actually good for us, I think just getting rid of the 5 is fine, which is what I did here. And this is the end result. Turns out there was a lot of value on the left and it was in the danger zone, but the tile itself was not the danger. It was Ricci, Tanya, Sanshugu. So it was again following that same pattern where the weight was bad, kind of gave it a while, decided time was up, and then hit the Ricci. So you definitely could shove the 8 here. At the same time, as I talked earlier, the easiest part of the hand to reform is this 5 pin, and I'm also worried about that hand across. Why did 6mon come out? So I'm thinking there's a decent chance the guy backed into either some sort of weird Chitoitsu or is just Tempai waiting on something in that area, looking for a better upgrade. So because there's a push from D, I don't want anything to do with this, and I just get out. But pushing the 8 is perfectly reasonable here. Again, if the 9 were not there, I don't think I could have pushed this 8 because I've already assumed that the weight's a bad shape. But here we actually see a Kabe of the 9. So the 8 only deals into Shampon, Tonki, or Ryanman, which, given the Sumigarichi, seems unlikely. But you can see here the 7, on the other hand, is the 8 was in the danger zone, so it felt a little off. But it's what's everyone else doing? Our condition, just get first, seems fine here. Whereas if we do deal into that and it's ugly, and turns out the 2 could have been even potentially worse, but Ricci, Tanyao, Sanshogu, well, then we go from clear first to within Mongun of dropping to second place or potentially worse, as South 4 dealer always can ruin your day. But I think both plays here are fine. All right, so we're starting to see some of these. What's the general problem with folding or Bizauri? And the answer is it's always negative EV. Now, it may be slightly less negative than just shoving, but we hate doing it generally. Of course, if we are not going to be Tempai at the end of the hand, that means we're always going to lose points. Either someone's going to sumo or you're going to paying Tempai payments at the end. The only way you don't is if someone else deals in for you. And you can't really bank on that. And over time, you'll end up losing more points. So you always need to be looking for a way back in, especially late. I generally start thinking about sneaking in for Tempai payments around turn 14. So early to mid third row. And of course, every time you get it, it's a 25 to 3,000 point swing. Now, that may not sound like as much because it's just a 2 on hand, but you think about it. So if I deal into Mongon 3 times, trying to show a 1 time out of 3 shoving in for K10, then that's worthwhile. So remember that. The other problem, though, of course, is are you going to have to shove 1 tile to get Tempai? Or are there 3 more discards you're also going to have to draw and then discard or fold on? So that also needs to be part of your calculations. But overall, this gets to the most basic rule in Mahjong. You play to win the game. Sometimes you just need to shove. The best defense is just winning the hand. Dealing in while folding, however, is the worst case scenario because we've cut off our own routes going forward and we still had the worst case deal in. Early reaches, particularly, are often bad, though not always, because people haven't had time to maneuver the hand around to a preferred shape to build around that Menzen Sumo Yaku, which talked about from the very beginning. They're often bad, and actually, a penchant, even Suji penchant, I believe, is as bad as a live regular 8 or regular 2. So even a Suji 3 or Suji 7 is terrible against the early Rishi because, again, they just haven't had time to maneuver the hand into something particularly useful. Long-term thoughts. Use the information as it comes in to decide just how far you want to extend yourself. Find your own comfort zone. Push yourself out of it for a while, and eventually you'll start realizing what you can actually do for yourself moving forward. The bots can give excellent guides as to where they think you should be, but people will generally not be as comfortable doing it. Deep fourth, on the other hand, can generally be ignored because they're just going to push, especially if it's not a plus minus type scenario. But even sometimes if it is, they'll say, hey, I can go for my Chinitsu. I'm willing to push from 3 away for it because there's enough value to justify it. It's not like I have anything to lose. And so always be very careful of someone who's in a deep hole because people don't generally just close the window and move on. They're trying to figure out a way back, and the most likely situation is they're building for value, even if it requires a lot of reckless play. On the other hand, that means if they're willing to push a lot, you can oftentimes just reach and watch them deal in because they're shoving a lot. So, final thoughts. The answer for every question of Mahjong is it depends, and this applies here to Mawashi too. There are no hard and fast rules. You need to be using the different techniques and strategies as for how you can properly defend. At the same time, determine your own thresholds. As I've mentioned, the bots can give you kind of basic guide, but you have to find your own comfort zone. Of course, you have to win hands, something I've been having problem with the last few seasons in Armal. But even so, even with a relatively low win rate, by not dealing in, I can at least mitigate some of that. Remember, what are we pushing for? What are we pushing with? Do we have value? Do we have speed? Do we have a reasonable path forward? Are we going to push a bunch of dangerous tiles and then just give up on the last one? If that's the plan, get out. At the same time, pushing just for template payments is oftentimes a really good play because they add up really quickly. Relatively safe is what you make it. And you're just trying to decide a basic idea. Can I make something from this hand? And the answer a lot of the times is just no. And then the question turns to, if I can't make something from this hand, can I make something towards the end of the hand if I draw the correct tiles? And the answer to that is more often no than yes, but just those few times you can sneak in and pull out a win towards the end or template payments towards the end, that's how you really separate yourself from other people. All right, that's basically all I have. So open session for Q&A.
Corak, thank you so much. This is amazing. Guys in DC Ricci Mahjong, now's the chance. Bring up some scenarios, ask some questions.
One thing that I really wanted to ask about is your thoughts on how trustworthy one chance is. I know obviously you talked about how you want to be using combination tactics when playing defense, but one of the things that's always in the back of my mind is another DC player, or I guess who's in Rochester now, Tess, said that once she stopped trusting one chance, her deal-in rate significantly lowered. That being said, she is a fairly defensive player, but in how trustworthy do you think one chance is? Do you think if it's one chance and the Ricci player dropped an early, like, say, 4 pin and it's one chance with the 4 pin, so you drop the 3 pin? If they drop the 4 pin early, then that makes it seem better. If they drop the 4 pin late, then it might be a 3-4-4. They're getting to a Ryanman. What are your kind of general thoughts with your experience?
You basically answered the question in there, which is it depends where you are in the hand. Early on, when you have limited information, something deals in occasionally is fine. As you get more information, you can eliminate more scenarios of what could potentially deal in. One chance become weaker and weaker to the point at which in third row, it's generally you can not like hard ignore it, but pretty much ignore it. Whereas first row, you often don't have a better option. So it is one of those things that can build towards it, but it is not something to be trusted. Similarly to Suji not being trusted. You should really kind of view them as the same, although Suji a little more reliable than one chance generally, but that it's something that it is a part of what you're doing. And this goes back to each tile having its own relative danger. And you can kind of establish based on how many Suji are left, what is the hand structure that I'm seeing, how many Dora are out there. So the answer here is going to be it is useful, but it is not a rule. And kind of similarly, since we had a dead pause there, you can even have double one chance where, hey, I see 777 and 888, the nine's probably safe. Well, that's stronger than regular one chance because that means they have to have the last seven and the last eight or be on Champon and Tonki. So all these things build up. And as you see more of those types of patterns building, pulling that information in and turning it into a rough evaluation of what each tile's relative danger is and comparing it with your own hand and whether it's worth pushing is how to do it. But in one of those late examples I talked about, we asked the question. It's a Mawashi discussion. Should I push this? The answer is No, it's not even worth watching. The hand's terrible. And a lot of the times, the hand just is terrible. And that's something that a lot of people just aren't willing to accept is a lot of the time the hand's just not worth playing. Even if you're playing significantly better than everyone else, you're only going to win 30, 32% of the time at best. If you're playing people at your level, you'll win 22, 23% of the time because another 6 to 12% will go to draws. So a lot of the times it's just not there. So the question is, what is your risk threshold and what are you doing to yourself in order to press that risk? All right, then. Any final questions or we're going to wrap it up?
If there are no final questions, then Korak, I just want to thank you so much for this lecture. Um, I've learned a lot. Uh, I feel better about some of the aggressive stuff I do. I probably do way too much, especially my own hand value is low, but I feel a little bit better about pushing because it seems like there are times to push.
A lot of people get into this hole where they get afraid to push, and this is particularly important in ladder, of course, because so many of them just focus on fourth avoidance. But that's not, especially in tournaments, you should just be pushing a lot more because the difference between minus 120 and 20 is irrelevant. You're not qualifying either way.
Thank you. Thank you also to the people who joined in. You said the slides will be available, so